There's been growing violence. I mean, this is something that's really been out of the headlines a lot, unless there's very high profile attacks like yesterday, which is quite unprecedented. And I think the assessment that you gave from Anshel Pfeffer suggesting this was the biggest intelligence failure in 50 years is absolutely correct.
Central to everything that is unfolding in Israel is the militant group Hamas. Its militants killed hundreds of civilians and kidnapped women and children yesterday. There are reports of rape. Videos show terrorists desecrating the bodies of their victims. Louise Callahan is the Times Middle East correspondent, and she's given us a brief guide to Hamas.
Hamas are a militant group who control the Gaza Strip. They've been in power there since 2005 when they won elections that gave them power over the Strip. But after that, they ousted all other parties and have basically since then ruled with an iron hand over the Strip. So they are a prescribed terror organisation by the UK and the EU and the US. But as well as that, they have a social wing and a political wing. So they both politically control Gaza, they provide social services there, and they are also a militant group which has been active since around the time of the first Intifada in Palestine in the late 80s.
That is Louise Callahan, who is the Times Middle East correspondent. You can read more of what she's written about this in the Sunday Times today. Lots of detail there. Well, let's speak to James Rogers, who is former Gaza correspondent. Good morning.
Good morning.
First of all, just explain to us, why do you think Hamas has chosen to act in this way now?
I think, there's been growing frustration in Gaza in particular and in the Palestinian territories more widely. As Louise's introduction was saying now, they're split in effect. Hamas controls the Gaza Strip and the Palestinian Authority still controls the West Bank. So there's a two-sided Palestinian leadership and has been really since Hamas took control of Gaza. But there's been growing violence. I mean, this is something that's really been out of the headlines a lot, unless there's very high profile attacks like yesterday, which is quite unprecedented. And I think the assessment that you gave from Anshel Pfeffer suggesting this was the biggest intelligence failure in 50 years is absolutely correct, just to try to put this in context, what's happened in the last 24 hours. But for many years, really, there's been a complete absence of any kind of political process. There's been no attempt really to try to find a longer-term solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict of the kind that we saw in diplomatic processes 20 years ago under leadership of George W. Bush around the time of the Iraq war. So I think absent that, and given the appalling living conditions in Gaza, I mean, just to try to explain to you what the territory is like, this is a very, very, very small piece of land. It's about 40 kilometers by 10, even more narrow at some points. And the United Nations estimates there are about 2.1 million people living there. So it is crowded. It is blockaded by Israel. All access to the territory in and out is controlled by Israel, with consequence restrictions on what can go in and out of the territory. And absent any attempt to try to create a Palestinian state, find a permanent solution to the conflict, it seems almost inevitable that acts like this will occur from time to time.
James, tell us about the makeup of Hamas, about the leadership, the strategy. How many people even are members? How many militant fighters are members?
Well, that's a difficult thing to estimate. I mean, just to give you some sort of historical background, this the Hamas actually has its roots in the Muslim Brotherhood, the movement that began in Egypt. And it broke away from the Brotherhood in 1987. It was founded by a Palestinian religious leader, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who was killed by Israel in 2004 during the Second Intifada, or Palestinian uprising against Israel. And as I think Louise Callahan pointed out in the introductory piece there, it is designated, its armed wing at least, is designated a terrorist organization by the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom. But within Gaza, it's much more than that. I mean, it started out also as a political movement, but also providing welfare to the population too. So in that sense, and also it was marked when its popularity was growing in Gaza in the early 2000s, at the time when I was living and working there. One of the factors behind its growing popularity then was that its leaders were seen as uncorrupt in comparison to some of the other Palestinian leaders, and many of them were seen as living rather simple lives compared to, the luxuries that some other Palestinian leaders granted themselves. So they did have a genuine popularity, but of course they're most known outside for their militant activities, the huge escalation of which we've seen in the last 24 hours.
Bearing in mind that you talk about not only the political and the military wing, but also the social, the welfare that they provide for people in Gaza, the food support and things. Does that mean Hamas is popular amongst civilians in Gaza? Is it possible to measure that popularity?
It is difficult to say that. There's no sort of real opinion polling. There's no electoral process there either. Although it is true that Hamas did win a majority of the seats the last time the Palestinians had elections back in the 2000s. But one would also imagine that now, although people might be reluctant to say this publicly because they might be seen as somehow undermining the Palestinian cause and resistance against Israel, one would imagine that, as in any political territory the world over, where people are living in such poor conditions there will be a degree of disaffection now. And it's also true to say, there was some of the Vox Pops people being spoken to, some of the reports from Gaza yesterday pointing out that, while a percentage of the population were welcoming the strikes on Israel, others will have been correctly anticipating that Israel's response would lead to widespread deaths in Gaza Strip, as indeed has been the case.
Hamas clearly doesn't act alone. So tell us more about who supports them and who funds them.
Well, the United States State Department estimated in 2021 that Hamas receives about $100 million a year. Hamas and the other Islamist movement in Gaza, Islamic Jihad, receive about $100 million a year from Iran. Aside from that, there are various donors across the Gulf and in other Arab and Muslim countries. But in terms of where they get their weapons from, as I say, all access to Gaza is controlled by Israel. Its southern border borders Egypt. There are tunnels there of varying sizes. Some of them even large enough to, a tunnel you think of something small with people crawling along. Some of them are like that, one imagines, but there are also ones that are large enough even to bring vehicles through. So that's the way that a lot of weapons get in. There are also a lot of weapons are made in Gaza, with the effect that they're not always terribly effective. I mean, certainly when I was there in the 2000s during the Second Palestinian Intifada, a lot of the weapons that were manufactured in Gaza were really sort of crude homemade devices. That is no longer the case, I think, because we can see from the scale of destruction yesterday, and it's really thanks to Israel's generally very effective missile defense system, Iron Dome, that the rockets that are fired from the territory do not normally cause more death and destruction.
So you've talked about Iran. What about Lebanon?
Well, there are links, of course, right across the region with other Islamist movements. If you think about the way that the Palestinian population was split up when people fled the territory that had been Mandate Palestine in 1948, when the State of Israel came into being. There are supporters, right across the region. So that does have various sources of funding, but its effectiveness, militarily at least, is normally limited by the fact that it can't. There's no easy way in and out of the Gaza Strip, and Israel, although it doesn't, apart from during particular military operations, have troops on the ground in Gaza, it does control all means of entry and exit to the territory.